Welcome back, friends. This is The Lone Star Ranger, Book 2, The Ranger by Zane Grey. West of the Pecos River, Texas extended a vast, wild region, barren in the north where the Llano Estacado spread its shifting sands, fertile in the south along the Rio Grande. A railroad marked undeviating course crossed 500 miles of this country, and the only villages and towns lay on or near this line of steel. Unsettled as this western Texas, and despite the acknowledged dominance of outlaw bands, the pioneers pushed steadily into it. First had come the lone rancher, then his neighbors in near and far valleys, and then hamlets, and at last railroad and towns. And still pioneers came, spreading deeper into the valleys, farther and wider over the plains. It was a mesquite-dotted, cactus-covered desert, but rich soil upon which water acted like magic. There was little grass to an acre, but there were millions of acres. The climate was wonderful. Cattle flourished and ranchers prospered. The Rio Grande flowed almost due south along the western boundary for 1,000 miles, and then, wary of its course, turned abruptly north to make what is called the Big Bend. The railroad running west cut across this bend, and all that country bounded on the north by the railroad and on the south by the river was as wild as the Staked Plains. It contained not one settlement. Across the face of this Big Bend, as if to isolate it, stretched the Ord mountain range, of which Mount Ord, Cathedral Mount, and Elephant Mount raised bleak peaks above their fellows. In the valleys of the foothills and out across the plains were ranches, and farther north, villages, and the towns of Alpine and Marfa. Like the other parts of the great Lone Star State, this section of Texas was a world in itself, a world where the riches of the rancher were ever enriching the outlaw. The village closest to the gateway of this outlaw-infested region was a little place called Ord, named after the dark peak that loomed some miles to the south. It had been settled originally by the Mexicans. There were still ruins of adobe missions, but with the advent of the rustler and outlaw, many inhabitants were shot or driven away. So that at the height of Ord's prosperity and evil sway there were but few Mexicans living there, and these had their choice between holding hand in glove with the outlaws or furnishing target practice for that wild element. Toward the close of the day in September, a stranger rode into Ord, and in a community where all the men were remarkable for one reason or another, he excited interest. His horse, perhaps, received the first of the most engaging attention, horses in that region being apparently more important than men. This particular horse did not attract with beauty at first glance. He seemed ugly, but he was a giant, black as coal, rough despite the care manifestly bestowed upon him, long of body, ponderous of limb, huge in every way. A bystander remarked that he had a grand head. True, if only his head had been seen, he would have been a beautiful horse. Like men, horses show what they are in shape, size, and the line, the character of the head. This one denoted fire, speed, blood, loyalty, and his eyes were as soft and dark as a woman's. His face was solid black except in the middle of his forehead where there was a round spot of white. "Say, mister, mind telling me his name?" asked a ragged urchin with born love of a horse in his eyes. "Bullet," replied the rider. "That there's for White Mark, ain't it?" whispered the youngster to the other. "Say, ain't he a whopper, biggest hoss I've ever seen." Bullet carried a huge black silver-ornamented saddle of Mexican make, a lariat and a canteen, a small pack rolled into a tarpaulin. This rider apparently put all care of appearances upon his horse. His apparel was the ordinary jeans of a cowboy without any vanity, and it was torn and travel-stained. His boots showed evidence of intimate acquaintance with cactus. Like his horse, this man was a giant in stature, but rangier, not so heavily built. Otherwise, the only striking thing about him was his somber face with piercing eyes, and hair white over the temples. He packed 2 guns, both down low. But that was too common a thing to attract notice in Big Bend. A closer observer, however, would have noted a singular fact. This rider's right hand was more bronzed, more weather-beaten than his left. He never wore a glove on that right hand. He had dismounted before a ramshackle structure that bore upon its wide, high-boarded front the sign Hotel. There were horsemen coming and going down the wide street between its rows of old stores, saloons, and houses. Ord certainly did not look enterprising. Americans had manifestly assimilated much of the leisure of the Mexicans. The hotel had a wide platform in front, and this did duty as a porch and a sidewalk. Upon it, leaning against a hitching rail, were men of varying ages, most of them slovenly in old jeans and slouched sombreros. Some were booted, belted, and spurred. No man wore a coat, but all wore vests. The guns in that group would have outnumbered the men. It was a crowd seemingly too lazy to be curious. Good-natured did not appear to be wanting, but it was not the frank and boisterous kind natural to the cowboy or rancher in town for a day. These men were idlers. What else, perhaps, was easy to conjecture. Certainly to this arriving stranger, who flashed a keen eye over him, they wore an atmosphere never associated with work. Presently a tall man with drooping sandy mustache leisurely detached himself from the crowd. "Howdy, stranger," he said. The stranger had bent over to loosen the cinches. He straightened up and nodded. Then, "I'm thirsty." That brought a broad smile to faces. It was a characteristic greeting. One and all trooped after a stranger into the hotel. It was a dark, ill-smelling barn of a place with a bar as high as a short man's head. The bartender, with a scared face, was serving drinks. "Line up, gent," said the stranger. They piled over one another to get to the bar, with coarse jests and oaths of laughter. None of them noted that the stranger did not appear so thirsty as he claimed to be. In fact, though he went through the motions, he did not drink at all. "My name's Jim Fletcher," said the tall man with the drooping sandy mustache. He spoke laconically. Nevertheless, there was a tone that showed he expected to be known. Something went with that name. The stranger did not appear to be impressed. "My name might be Blazes, but it ain't," he replied. "What do you call this bird?" "Stranger, this here Tropos bears the handle Ord. Is that new to you?" He leaned back against the bar, and now his little yellow eyes, clear as a crystal, flawless as a hawk's, fixed on the stranger. Other men crowded close, forming a circle, curious, ready to be friendly to otherwise. According to how the tall interrogator marked the newcomer. "Sure, Ord's a little strange to me. Off the railroad some, ain't it? Funny trails hereabouts. How fur are you going?" "I reckon I was going as fur as I could," replied the stranger with a hard laugh. His reply had subtle reaction on the listening circle. Some of the men exchanged glances. Fletcher stroked his drooping mustache, seemed thoughtful, but lost something of that piercing scrutiny. "Well, Ord's the jumping-off place," he said presently. "Sure you've heard of Big Bend country?" "I sure have, and was making tracks for it," replied the stranger. Fletcher turned toward the man in the outer edge of the group. "Nell, come here." This individual elbowed his way in and was seen to be scarcely more than a boy, almost pale beside those bronzed men, with a long, expressionless face, thin and sharp. "Nell, this here's Fletcher," wheeled to the stranger. "What do you call yourself?" "I'd hate to mention what I've been calling myself lately." This Sally fletched another laugh. The stranger appeared cool, careless, indifferent. Perhaps he knew, as the others present knew, that his show of Fletcher's, his pretense of introduction, was merely talk while he was looked over. Nell stepped up, and it was easy to see from the way Fletcher relinquished his part in the situation that a man greater than he had appeared on scene. "Any business here?" he queried curtly. When he spoke, his expressionless face was in strange contrast with the ring, the quality, and the cruelty of his voice. This voice betrayed an absence of humor, friendliness of heart. "Nope," replied the stranger. "Know anybody hereabouts?" "Nary a one." "Just riding through?" "Yep." "Sloping for back country, eh?" There was a pause. The stranger appeared to grow a little resentful and drew himself up disdainfully. "Well, considering y'all seem so damn friendly and all curious down here in this Big Bend country, I don't mind saying yes, I'm on the dodge," he replied, with deliberate sarcasm. "From west of Ord? Out El Paso way, maybe?" "Sure." "Uh-huh, thought so." Nell's words cut the air, stilled the room. "You're from way down the river. That's what they say down here, on the dodge. Stranger, you're a liar." With swift clink of spur, thump of boot, the crowd split, leaving Nell and the stranger in the center. Wild breed of that ilk never made a mistake in judging a man's nerve. Nell had cut out with a trenchant call and stood ready. The stranger suddenly lost his every semblance to the rough and easy character before manifest in him. He became bronze. The situation seemed familiar to him. His eyes held a singular, piercing light that danced like a compass needle. Sure I lied," he said. "So I ain't taking offense at the way you called me. I'm looking to make friends, not enemies. You don't strike me as one of them four flushes aching to kill somebody. But if you are, go ahead on. You see, I never throw a gun on them fellers till they go for theirs first." Nell coolly eyed his antagonist, his strange face not changing in the least, yet somehow it was evident in his look that here was metal which rang differently from what he had expected. Invited to start a fight or withdraw, as he chose, Nell proved himself big in the manner characteristic of only the genuine gunman. "Stranger, I pass," he said, and turning to the bar, he ordered liquor. The tension relaxed, the silence broke, the men filled up the gap. The incident seemed closed. Jim Fletcher attached himself to the stranger, and now both respect and friendliness tempered his asperity. "Well, for want of a better handle, I'll call you Dodge," he said. "Dodge is good as any. Gents, line up again, and if you can't be friendly, be careful." Such was Buck Duane's debut in the little outlaw hamlet of Ord. Duane had been 3 months out in Nueces country. At El Paso, he bought the finest horse he could find and armed and otherwise outfitted to suit him. He had taken to unknown trails. Leisurely, he rode from town to town, village to village, ranch to ranch, fitting his talk and occupation to the impression he wanted to make upon the different people who he met. He was in turn a cowboy, rancher, cattleman, stock buyer, boomer, land hunter, and long before he reached the wild, inhospitable Ord, he had acted the part of an outlaw, drifting into new territory. He passed on leisurely because he wanted to learn the lay of the country, the location of the villages and ranches, the work habit, gossip, pleasures, and fears of the people with whom he came in contact. The one subject most impelling to him, outlaws, he never mentioned, but by talking all around it, sifting the old ranch and cattle story, he acquired a knowledge calculated to aid his plot. And this game time was of no moment. If necessary, he would take years to accomplish his task. The stupendous and perilous nature of it showed in the slow, wary preparation. When he heard Fletcher's name and faced Nell, he knew he had reached the place that he sought. Ord was a hamlet on the fringe of the grazing country, of doubtful honesty, from which surely winding trails led down into the free and never disturbed paradise of outlaws, the Big Bend. Duane made himself agreeable, yet not too much so, to Fletcher and several other men, disposed to talk and drink and eat, and after having a care for his horse, he rode out of town a couple of miles to a grove he'd marked, and there, well hidden, he prepared to spend the night. The proceeding served a double purpose. He was safer, and the habit would look well in the eyes of outlaws, who would be more inclined to see him in the lone wolf fugitive. Long since Dwayne had fought out a battle with himself, won a hard-earned victory. His outer life, the action, was much the same as it had been, but the inner life had tremendously changed. He could never become a happy man. He could never shake utterly those haunting phantoms that had once been his despair and madness, but he had assumed a task of impossible for any man save one like him. He had felt the meaning of it grow strangely and wonderfully, and through that flourished up consciousness of how passionately he could now clung to this thing which would blot out his former infamy. The iron fetters no more threatened his hands, the iron door no more haunted his dreams. He never forgot that he was free. Strangely, too, along with this feeling of new manhood, there gathered the force of imperious desire to run these chief outlaws to their dooms. He never called them outlaws, but rustlers, thieves, robbers, murderers, criminals. He sensed the growth of relentless driving passion, and sometimes he feared that more than newly acquired zeal and pride in his ranger service, it was the old, terrible inherited killing instinct lifting its hydra head in a new guise. But of that he could not be sure. He dreaded the thought. He could only wait. Another aspect of change in Dwayne, neither passionate nor driving, yet not improbably even more potent of the new significance to life, was the imperceptible return of an old love nature dead during his outlaw days. For years, a horse had been only a machine of locomotion to carry him from place to place, to beat spur and goad mercilessly into flight. Now this giant black with its splendid head was a companion, a friend, a brother, a loved thing, guarded jealously, fed and trained, ridden with intense appreciation of his great speed and endurance. For years, daytime with its birth of sunrise on through long hours to ruddy close had been used for sleep, rest in some rocky hole or willow brake, or deserted hut, and had been hated because it augmented danger of pursuit, because it drove the fugitive to lonely, wretched hiding. Now the dawn was a greeting, a promise of another day, to ride, to plan, to remember, and sun, wind, cloud, rain, and sky were all joys to him, somehow speaking to him of freedom. For years, the night had been black space during which he had to ride unseen along endless trails, to peer with cat eyes through the gloom for the moving shape that ever pursued him. Now the twilight and the dusk and shadows of the grove and canyon darkened into night with its train of stars and brought him calm reflection of the day's happenings, of morrow's possibilities, perhaps a sad, brief procession of the old phantoms, and then sleep. For years, canyons and valleys and mountains had been looked at as retreats that might be dark and wild enough to hide even for an outlaw. Now he saw these features of the great desert with something of the eyes of the boy who'd once burned for adventure and life among them. This night a wonderful afterglow lingered long in the west, and against the golden red of the clear sky the bold black head of Mount Ord reared itself aloft, beautifully but aloof, sinister yet calling. Small wonder that Dwayne gazed in fascination upon the peak. Somewhere deep in its corrugated sides, or lost in the rugged canyon, was hidden the secret stronghold of the master outlaw, Cheseldine. All down along the ride from El Paso, Dwayne heard of Cheseldine, of his band of fearful deeds, his cunning, his widely separated raids, of flitting here and there like a jack-o'-lantern, but never a word of his den, never a word of his appearance. Next morning, Dwayne did not return to Ord. He struck off to the north, riding down a rough, slow-descending road that appeared to have been used occasionally for cattle driving. As he had ridden in from the west, this northern direction led him into a totally unfamiliar territory. While he passed on, however, he exercised such keen observation that in future he would know whatever might be of service to him if he chanced that way again. The rough, wild, brush-covered slope down from the foothills gradually leveled out into the plain and magnificent grazing country upon which, till noon of that day, Duane did not see a herd of cattle or a ranch. About that time he made out smoke from the railroad, and after a couple of hours' riding he entered a town which inquiry discovered to be Bradford. It was the largest town he had visited since Marfa, and he calculated must have 1,500 inhabitants, not included Mexicans. He decided this would be a good place for him to hold up for a while, being the nearest town to Ord, only 40 miles away, so hitched his horse in front of the store and leisurely set about studying Bradford. It was after dark, however, that Duane verified suspicions concerning Bradford. The town was awake after dark, and there was one long row of saloons, dance hall, gambling resorts in full blast. Duane visited them all and was surprised to see wildness and license equal to that of the old river camp of the Blands in the palmiest days. Here it was forced upon him that further west one traveled along the sparser the respectable settlements and the more numerous the hard characters, and in consequence the greater the element of lawlessness. Duane returned to his lodging house with the conviction that McNally's task of cleaning up the Big Bend country was a stupendous one. Yet, he reflected, a company of intrepid and quick-shooting rangers could have soon cleaned up this Bradford. The innkeeper had one other guest that night, a long, black-coated and wide-sombreroed Texan who reminded Duane of his grandfather. This man had penetrating eyes and courtly manner, and unmistakably leaning toward companionship with mint juleps. The gentleman introduced himself as Colonel Webb of Marfa, and took it as a matter of course that Duane made no comment about himself. "Sir, it's all one to me," he said blandly, waving his hand. "I've traveled. Texas is free, and this frontier is one where it's healthier and just as friendly for a man to have no curiosity about his companion. You might be Cheseldine of the Big Bend, or you might be Judge Little of El Paso. It's all one to me. I enjoy drinking with you anyway." Duane thanked him, conscious of reserve and dignity that he would not have felt or pretended 3 months before. And then, as always, he was a good listener. Colonel Webb told, among other things, they had to come out to the Big Bend and look over the affairs of a deceased brother who had been a rancher and a sheriff of one of these towns, Fairdale by name. "Found no affairs, no ranch, not even his grave," said Colonel Webb. "And I tell you, sir, if hell's any tougher than this Fairdale, I don't want to expiate my sins there." "Fairdale, I imagine sheriffs had a hard row to hoe out there," replied Duane, trying not to appear curious. The colonel swore lustily. "My brother was the only honest sheriff Fairdale ever had. It was wonderful how long he lasted. But he had nerve. He could throw a gun, and he was on the square. Then he was wise enough to confine his work to offenders of his own town, the neighborhood. He let the riding outlaws alone, else he wouldn't have lasted at all. What this frontier needs, sir, is about 6 companies of Texas Rangers." Duane was aware of the colonel's close scrutiny. "Do you know anything about the service?" he asked. "I used to. 10 years ago when I lived in San Antonio, a fine body of men, sir, and the salvation of Texas." "Governor Stone doesn't entertain that opinion," said Duane. Here Colonel Webb exploded. Manifestly, the governor was not his choice for a chief executive of the great state. He talked politics for a while, and the vast territory west of the Pecos that seemed to never get a benefit from Austin. He talked enough for Duane to realize that here was just the kind of intelligent, well-informed, honest citizen that he had been trying to meet. He exerted himself thereafter to be agreeable and interesting, and saw presently that here was an opportunity to make a valuable acquaintance, if not a friend. "I'm a stranger in these parts," said Duane finally. "What is the outlaw situation you speak of?" "It's damnable, sir. Unbelievable. Not rustling anymore, but just wholesale herd stealing, in which some of the big cattlemen, supposed to be honest, are equally guilty with the outlaws. On this border, the rustlers always been able to steal cattle in any numbers. But to get rid of big bunches, that's a hard job. The gang operating between here and Valentine evidently have not this trouble. Nobody knows where the stolen stock goes, but I'm not alone in my opinion that most of it goes to several big stockmen. They ship to San Antonio, Austin, New Orleans, also to El Paso. If you travel the stock road between here and Marfa and Valentine, you'll see dead cattle all along the line and stray cattle out in the scrub. The herds have been driven fast and far, and the stragglers are not rounded up. Wholesale business, eh? Remarked Duane. Are these big stock buyers? Colonel Webb seemed a little startled at the abrupt query. He bent his penetrating gaze upon Duane and thoughtfully stroked his beard. Names, of course, I'll not mention. Opinions are one thing, direct accusations another. It's not healthy in this country to be an informer. When it comes to outlaws themselves, Colonel Webb was disposed to talk freely. Duane could not judge whether Colonel had a hobby of that subject or the outlaws were so striking in personality indeed that any man would know all about them. The great name along the river was Cheseldine, but it seemed to be a name detached from the individual. No person of veracity known to Colonel Webb had ever seen Cheseldine, and those who claimed that doubtful honor varied so diversely in descriptions of the chief that they confused the reality and lent to the outlaw only further mystery. Strange to say of an outlaw leader, as there was no one who could identify him, so there was no one who could prove he actually killed a man. Blood flowed like water over the Big Bend country, and it was Cheseldine who spilled it. Yet the fact remained there were no eyewitnesses to connect any individual called Cheseldine with these deeds of violence. But in striking contrast to this mystery was the person, character, and cold-blooded action of Poggin and Nell, the chief lieutenants. They were familiar figures in all the towns within 200 miles of Bradford. Nell had a record, but as gunman with an incredible list of victims, Poggin was supreme. If Poggin had a friend, no one ever heard of him. There were 100 stories of his nerve, his wonderful speed with a gun, his passion for gambling, his love of horse, his cold, implacable, inhuman wiping out of his path any man that crossed it. Cheseldine is a name, a terrible name, said Colonel Webb. Sometimes I wonder if he's not only a name. In that case, where do the brains of the gang come from? No, there must be a master craftsman behind this border pillage, a master capable of handling those terrorists, Poggin and Nell. Of all the thousands of outlaws developed by western Texas in the last 20 years, these three are the greatest. In southern Texas, down between the Pecos and the Nueces, there have been and still are many bad men, but I doubt if any outlaw there, possibly excepting Buck Duane, ever equaled Poggin. You heard of this Duane? Yeah, a little, replied Duane quietly. I'm from South Texas. Buck Duane, then, is known out here. Why, man, where isn't his name known? Returned Colonel Webb. I've kept track of his record as I have all the others. Of course, Duane, being a lone outlaw, is somewhat of a mystery also, but not like Cheseldine. Out here we've drifted many stories about Duane. Horrible, some of them, but despite them, a sort of romance clings to that Nueces outlaw. He's killed 3 great outlaw leaders, I believe, Bland, Hardin, and the other I forgot. Hardin was known in the Big Bend, had friends here. Bland had a hard name in the Del Rio. And this man, Duane, enjoys rather an unusual respite west of the Pecos? Inquired Duane. He's considered more of an enemy to his kind than to honest men. I understand Duane had many friends. That whole county swear by him, secretly, of course, for he's hunted outlaw and rewards on his head. His fame in this country appears to hang on his matchless gunplay and his enmity towards outlaw chiefs. I've heard many a rancher say, I wish to God that Buck Duane would drift out over here. I give 100 pesos to see him at Pawgan meet. It's a singular thing, stranger, how jealous these great outlaws are of each other. Yes, indeed, all about them is singular, replied Duane. Has Cheseldine's gang been seen or busy lately? No. This section has been free of rustling for months, though there's unexplained movements of stock. Probably all the stock that's been shipped now was rustled long ago. Cheseldine works over a wide section, too wide for news to travel inside of weeks. Then sometimes he's not heard of for a spell. These lulls are pretty surely indicative of a big storm sooner or later, and Cheseldine deals, as they grow fewer and farther between, certainly get bigger and more daring. There are some people who think Cheseldine had nothing to do with the bank robberies and train hold-ups during the last few years in this country, but that's poor reasoning. The jobs have been done too well, too surely covered, to be the work of greasers or ordinary outlaws. What's your view of the outlook? How's all this going to wind up? Will the outlaw ever be driven out? Asked Duane. Never. There'll always be outlaws along the Rio Grande. All the armies in the world couldn't comb the wild breaks of 1,500 miles of river, but the sway of the outlaw, such as enjoyed by these great leaders, will sooner or later be past. The criminal element flocked to the southwest, but not so thick and fast as the pioneers. Besides, the outlaws kill themselves, and the ranchers are slowly rising in wrath, if not action. That will come soon. If they only had a leader to start a fight, but that will come. There's talk of vigilantes, the same hat were organized in California and now in force in Idaho. So far it's only talk. But the time will come, and the days of Cheseldine and Pawgan are numbered. Duane went to bed that night exceedingly thoughtful. The long trail was growing hot. This voluble colonel had given him new ideas. It came to Duane in surprise that he was famous along the upper Rio Grande. Assuredly, he would not long be able to conceal his identity. He had no doubt that he would soon meet the chiefs of this clever and bold rustling gang. He could not decide whether he would be safer unknown or known. In the latter case, his one chance lay in the fatality connected with his name, in his power to look and act it. Duane had never dreamed of any sleuth-hound tendency in his nature, but how he felt something like one. Above all others, his mind was fixed on Pawgan the brute, the executor of Cheseldine's will, but mostly upon Pawgan the gunman. This in itself was a warning to Duane. He felt terrible forces working within him. There was the stern, indomitable resolve to make McNally's boast good to the governor of the state, to break up Cheseldine's gang. Yet this was not Duane's mind before a strange, grim, and deadly instinct which he had to drive away for fear he would find it in passion to kill Pawgan. Not for the state, not for his word, not to McNally, but for himself. He had his father's blood, and the hard years made Duane the kind of man who instinctively wanted to meet Pawgan. He was sworn to McNally's service and fought himself to keep that, and that only, in his mind. Duane ascertained that Fairdale was situated 2 days' ride from Bradford toward the north. There was a stage which made the journey twice a week. Next morning, Duane mounted his horse and headed for Fairdale. He rode leisurely, as he wanted to learn all he could about the country. There were few ranches. The farther he traveled, the better grazing he encountered. And strange to note, the fewer herds of cattle. It was just sunset when he made out a cluster of adobe houses that marked the halfway point between Bradford and Fairdale. Here, Duane had learned, was stationed a comfortable inn for wayfarers. When he drew up before the inn, the landlord and his family and a number of loungers greeted him laconically. "Beat the stage in, eh?" remarked one. "There she comes now," said another. "Joel sure is driving tonight." Far down the road, Duane saw a cloud of dust and horses and a lumbering coach, and He had looked after the needs of his horse. He returned to the group before the inn. They awaited the stage with interest common to isolated people. Presently it rolled up, a large, mud-bespattered and dusty vehicle, littered with baggage on top and tied on behind. A number of passengers alighted, 3 of whom excited Dwayne's interest. One was a tall, dark, striking-looking man, and the other were 2 ladies, wearing long gray ulsters and veils. Dwayne heard the proprietor of the inn address the man as Colonel Longstreth, and as the party entered the inn, Dwayne's quick ears caught a few words which acquainted him with the fact that Longstreth was the mayor of Fairdale. Dwayne passed inside himself to learn that supper would soon be ready. At a table he found himself opposite the 3 who had attracted his attention. "Ruth, I envy the lucky cowboys," Longstreth was saying. Ruth was a curly-headed girl with gray or hazel eyes. "I'm crazy to ride bronchos," she said. Dwayne gathered she was on a visit to western Texas. The other girl's deep voice, sweet like a bell, made Dwayne regard her closer. She had beauty as he had never seen it in another woman. She was slender, but with the development of her figure gave Dwayne the impression she was 20 years old or more. She had the most exquisite hands Dwayne had ever seen. She did not resemble the colonel, who was evidently her father. She looked tired, quiet, even melancholy. Finely chiseled oval face, clear olive-tinted skin, long eyes set wide apart and black as coal. Beautiful to look into, a slender, straight nose that had something nervous and delicate about it which made Dwayne think of his thoroughbred, and a mouth by no means small but perfectly curved, and hair like jet. All the features proclaimed her beauty to Dwayne. Dwayne believed her a descendant of one of the old French families of eastern Texas. He was sure of it when she looked at him, drawn by his rather persistent gaze. There were pride, fire, and passion in her eyes. Dwayne felt himself blushing in confusion. His stare at her had been rude, perhaps, but unconscious. How many years had passed since he'd seen a girl like her? Thereafter he kept his eyes upon his plate, yet he seemed to be aware that he had aroused the interest of both girls. After supper, the guests assembled in a big sitting room where an open fireplace with the blazing mesquite sticks gave out warmth and a cheery glow. Dwayne took a seat by a table in the corner and, finding a paper, began to read. Presently, when he glanced up and saw the 2 dark-faced men, strangers who had not appeared before and were peering in from the doorway, when they saw Dwayne had observed them, they stepped back out of sight. It flashed over Dwayne that these strangers acted suspiciously. In Texas in the 70s, it was always bad policy to let strangers go unheeded. Dwayne pondered a moment, then went out to look over these 2 men. The doorway opened into a patio, and across which was a little dingy, dim-lighted bar-room. Here Dwayne found the innkeeper dispensing drinks to the 2 strangers. They glanced up when he entered, and one of them whispered he imagined he'd seen one of them before. In Texas, where outdoor men were so rough, bronzed, and bold, and sometimes grim of aspect, it was no easy task to pick out the crooked ones. But Dwayne's years on the border had augmented a natural instinct or gift to read character, or at least sense the evil in men, and he knew at once these strangers were dishonest. "Hey, something?" one of them asked, leering. Both looked Dwayne up and down. "No thanks. Don't drink," Dwayne replied, and returned their scrutiny with interest. "How's Trix and the big man?" Both men stared. Taking only a close glance at Dwayne to recognize the type of ruffian most frequently met along the river. These strangers had that stamp, and their surprise proved he was right. Here the innkeeper showed signs of uneasiness and seconded the surprise of his customers. No more was said in that instant, and 2 rather hurriedly went out. "Say, boss, do you know those fellows?" Dwayne asked the innkeeper. "Nope." "Which way'd they come?" "Now I think of it, them fellers rode in from both corners today," he replied, and he put both hands on the bar and looked at Dwayne. "They nooned, eh? Come from Bradford, they said, and trailed in after the stage." When Dwayne returned to the sitting room, Colonel Longstreth was absent, also several of the other passengers. Miss Ruth sat in a chair he had vacated, and across the table from her sat Miss Longstreth. Dwayne had directly to them. "Excuse me," said Dwayne, addressing them. "I want to tell you there are a couple of rough-looking men here. I just seen 'em. They mean evil. Tell your father to be careful, lock your doors, and bar your windows up tonight." "Oh," cried Ruth very low. "Ray, do you hear?" "Thank you. We'll be careful," said Miss Longstreth gratefully. The rich color had faded in her cheek. "I saw those men watching you from that door. They had such bright black eyes. Is there really danger here?" "I think so," was Dwayne's reply. Soft, swift steps behind him preceded a harsh voice. "Hands up!" No man quicker than Dwayne to recognize the intent in those words. His hand shot up. Miss Ruth uttered a little frightened cry and sank into her chair. Miss Longstreth turned white, her eyes dilated. Both girls were staring at someone behind Dwayne. "Turn around," ordered the harsh voice. The big, dark stranger, the bearded one who had whispered to his comrade in the barroom, asked Dwayne to drink, had him covered with a cocked gun. He strode forward, his eyes gleaming. He pressed the gun against him, and with his other hand dove into his side coat pocket and tore out his roll of bills. Then he reached low on Dwayne's hip, felt his gun, and took it. Then he slapped the other hip, evidently in search of another weapon. That done, he backed away, wearing an expression of fiendish satisfaction that made Dwayne think he was just a common thief, a novice at this kind of game. His comrade stood in the door with a gun leveled at the two other men who stood there frightened and speechless. "Get a move on, Bill," called this fellow, and we took a hasty glance backward. A stamp of hoofs came from outside. Of course the robbers had horses waiting. The one called Bill strode across the room with a brutal, careless haste, began to prod the two men with his weapon and search them. The robber in the doorway called, "Russell," and disappeared. Dwayne wondered where the innkeeper was, and Colonel Longstreth and the other two pastors. The bearded robber quickly got through with his searching, and from his growls Dwayne gathered he had not been well remunerated. Then he wheeled once more. Dwayne had not moved a muscle, stood perfectly calm, with his hands high. The robber strode back with his bloodshot eyes fastened upon the girls. Miss Longstreth never flinched, but the little girl appeared to be faint. "Don't yap there," he said, low and hard. He thrust his gun close to Ruth, and Dwayne knew for sure that he was no knight of the road, but a plain cutthroat robber. Danger always made Dwayne exult in a kind of cold glow. But now something hot worked within him. He had a little gun in his pocket, and the robber had missed it. He began to calculate his chances. "Any money, jewelry, diamonds?" ordered the ruffian fiercely. Miss Ruth collapsed. Then he made at Miss Longstreth. She stood with her hands at her breast, and evidently the robber took his position to mean that she had valuables concealed there. But Dwayne fancied she instinctively pressed her hands against her throbbing heart. "Come out with it," he said harshly, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she cried, her eyes ablaze. She did not move. She had nerve. It made Dwayne thrill. He saw he was going to get a chance. Waiting had been science with him, but here it was hard. Miss Ruth had fainted, and that was well. Miss Longstreth had fight in her, which fact helped Dwayne, yet made injury possible to her. She eluded with two lunges the man made toward her. Then his rough hand caught her wrist, and with one pull ripped her asunder, exposing her beautiful shoulder white as snow. She cried out. The prospect of being robbed or even killed had not shaken Miss Longstreth. Nerve, as had this brutal tearing off, half to her waist. The ruffian was only turned partially away from Dwayne. For himself, he could have waited no longer, but for her, that gun was still held dangerously upward close to her. Dwayne watched only that. Then a bellow made him jerk his head. Colonel Longstreth stood in the doorway in magnificent rage. He had no weapon. Strange how he showed no fear. He bellowed something against. Dwayne's shifting glance caught the robber's sudden movement. It was kind of a start. He seemed stricken. Dwayne expected him to shoot Longstreth. Instead, the hand that clutched Miss Longstreth's torn waist loosened its hold. The other hand, with his cocked weapon, slowly dropped to a point at the floor. That was Dwayne's chance. Swift as a flash, he drew his gun and fired. Thud went his bullet, and could not tell on the instant whether it hit the robber or went into the ceiling. Then the robber's gun boomed harmlessly. He fell with blood spurting over his face. Dwayne realized he hit him, but the small bullet had glanced. Miss Longstreth reeled and might have fallen had Dwayne not supported her. It was only a few steps to the couch, to which he half led and carried her. Then he rushed out of the room, across the patio, through the bar to the yard. Nevertheless, he was cautious. In the gloom stood a saddled horse, probably the one belonging to the fellow he shot. His comrade had escaped. Returning to the sitting room, Dwayne found a condition approaching pandemonium. The innkeeper rushed in, pitchfork in hand. Evidently he had been out the barn. He was now shouting to find out what happened. Joel, the stage driver, was trying to quiet the men who had been robbed. The women, the wife of the men, had come in, and she had been in hysterics. The girls were still and white. The robber Bill laid there where he had fallen, and Dwayne guessed that he made a fair shot after all. And lastly, the thing that struck Dwayne most of all was Longstreth's rage. He never saw such passion. Like a caged lion, Longstreth stalked and roared. There came a quieter moment in which the innkeeper shrilly protested. "Man, what are you raving about? Nobody's hurt, and that's lucky. I swear to God I hadn't nothing to do with them fellers." "Ought to kill you anyhow," replied Longstreth, and his voice now astounded Dwayne, was so full of power. Upon examination, Dwayne found that his bullet furrowed in the robber's temple and torn a great piece out of his scalp. And as Dwayne guessed, at a glance, and he was not seriously injured and had already showed signs of returning to consciousness. "Drag him out of here," ordered Longstreth, and he returned to his daughter. Before the innkeeper reached the robber, Dwayne secured the money and the gun taken from him, and presently recovered the property of the other men. Joel helped the innkeeper carry the injured man somewhere outside. Miss Longstreth was sitting white but composed upon the couch, where lay Miss Ruth, who evidently had been carried there by the colonel. Dwayne did not think she had wholly lost consciousness, and now she lay very still, with eyes dark and shadowy, her face pallid and wet. The colonel now, he finally remembered his women folks, seemed to be gentle and kind. He talked soothingly to Miss Ruth and made light of the adventure, said she must learn to have nerve out here where things can happen. "Can I be of any service?" asked Dwayne solicitously. "Thanks. I guess there's nothing you can do. Talk to these frightened girls while I go see what's to be done with that thick-skulled robber," and he replied, and telling the girls that there was no more danger, he went out. Miss Longstreth sat with one hand holding her torn waist in place and the other extended Dwayne. She took it awkwardly and felt a strange thrill. "You saved my life," she said in grave, sweet seriousness. No, Dwayne exclaimed. "He might have struck you, hurt you, but no more. I saw murder in his eyes. He thought I had jewels under my dress. I couldn't bear his touch. The beast! I'd have fought. Surely my life was in peril." "Did you kill him?" asked Miss Ruth, who lay listening. "Oh, no, he's not badly hurt." "Well, I'm very glad he's alive," said Miss Longstreth, shuddering. "My intention was bad enough," Dwayne went on. "It was a ticklish place for me. You see, he was half drunk, and I was afraid his gun might go off. Fool careless he was." "You say you didn't save me," Miss Longstreth returned quickly. "Well, let it go at that," Dwayne responded. "I'll save you something." "Tell me all about it," asked Miss Ruth, who was fast recovering. Rather embarrassed, Dwayne briefly told the incident from his point of view. "Then you stood there the whole time with your hands up, thinking of nothing, watching for nothing except a little moment when you might draw a gun?" asked Miss Ruth. "I guess that's about it," he replied. "Cousin," said Miss Longstreth thoughtfully, "it was fortunate for us this gentleman happened to be here." Papa Scouts laughs at danger. He seemed to think there was no danger, yet he raved after it came. "Go with us all the way to Fairdale, please?" asked Miss Ruth, sweetly offering her hand. "I'm Ruth Herbert, and this is my cousin, Ray Longstreth. I'm traveling that way, replied Dwayne in great confusion. He did not know how to meet this situation. Colonel Longstreth returned them after bidding Dwayne good night, which seemed rather curt by contrast to the graciousness of the girls. He led them away. Before going to bed, Dwayne went outside to take a look at the injured robber and perhaps ask him a few questions. To Dwayne's surprise, he was gone. So was his horse. The innkeeper was dumbfounded. He said that he left fellow on the floor in the barroom. Had he come to? Inquired Dwayne. Sure, he asked for whiskey. Did he say something else? No, not to me. I heard him talking to the father of them there girls. You mean Colonel Longstreth? I reckon. He's sure some riled, wasn't he? Just as if it was to blame for that two-bit hold-up. What did you make of the old gent's rage? Asked Dwayne, watching the innkeeper. He scratched his head dubiously. He was sincere, and Dwayne believed in his honesty. Well, I'm doggone if I know what to make of it, but I reckon he's either crazy or got more nerve than most Texans. More nerve, maybe, Dwayne replied. Show me a bed now, innkeeper. Once in bed, Dwayne composed himself to think over several events of the evening. He called up the details of the holdup and carefully revolved them around his mind. The colonel's wrath on the circumstances where almost any Texan would have been cool, nonplussed, and Dwayne, he put it down to choleric temperament. He pondered long in action of the robber when Longstreth's bellow of rage burst upon him. This ruffian, as bold and mean a type as Dwayne had ever encountered, had, for some cause or another, been startled. From whatever point Dwayne viewed that man's strange indecision, he could come to only one conclusion. His start, his check, his fear had been that of recognition. Dwayne compared this effect with suddenly acquired sense that he gotten of Colonel Longstreth's powerful personality. Why had the desperate robber lowered his gun and stood paralyzed at the sight and sound of the mayor of Fairdale? This was not answerable. There might have been a number of reasons, all to Colonel Longstreth's credit, but Dwayne could not understand. Longstreth had not appeared to see danger for his daughter, even though she had been roughly handled and had advanced in front of a cocked gun. Dwayne probed deep into this singular fact, and he brought to bear on the thing all his knowledge and experience of violent Texas life, and he found that the instant Colonel Longstreth had appeared on the scene, there was no further danger threatening his daughter. Why? That likewise Dwayne could not answer. Then his rage, Dwayne concluded, had been solely at the idea of his daughter being assaulted by a robber. This deduction was indeed a thought disturber, but Dwayne put it aside to crystallize and for more careful consideration. Next morning, Dwayne found that little town was called Sanderson. It was larger than he first supposed. He walked up the main street and back again. Just as he arrived, some horsemen rode up to him and dismounted. And at this juncture, Longstreth's party came out. Dwayne heard Colonel Longstreth utter an exclamation. Then he saw him shake hands with a tall man. Longstreth looked surprised and angry. He spoke with force, but Dwayne could not hear what it was said. The fellow laughed, yet somehow he struck Dwayne as sullen, until suddenly he espied Miss Longstreth. Then his face changed. He removed his sombrero. Dwayne went closer. Floyd, did you come with the teams? Asked Longstreth sharply. Not me. I rode a horse, good and hard, was the reply. Huh. I'll have a word to say to you later. Then Longstreth turned to his daughter. Ray, here's the cousin I told you about. You used to play with him 10 years ago. Floyd Lawson. Floyd, my daughter, and my niece, Ruth Herbert. Dwayne always scrutinized everyone he met, and now with dangerous game to play with a consciousness of Longstreth's unusual, significant personality, he bent a keen and searching glance upon this Floyd Lawson. He was under 30, yet gray at the temples, dark, smooth-shaven, with lines left by wildness, dissipation, shadows under dark eyes, a mouth strong and bitter, and a square chin. A reckless, careless and handsome, sinister face, strangely losing the hardness when he smiled. The grace of a gentleman clung around him, seemed like an echo in his mellow voice. Duane doubted that. Not that he, like many a young man, had drifted out of the frontier, where rough and wild life had wrought sternly, but had not quite affected the mark of a good family. Colonel Longstreth apparently did not share the pleasure of his daughter and his niece in the advent of his cousin. Something hinged on this meeting. Duane grew intensely curious, but as the stage appeared ready for the journey, he had no further opportunity to gratify it. Duane followed the stage through town, out into the open onto the wide, hard-packed road showing years of travel. It headed northwest. To the left rose a range of low, bleak mountains. He had noted them yesterday, and to the right sloped the mesquite-patched sweep of ridge and flat. The driver pushed his team to a fast trot, which gait surely covered ground rapidly. The stage made 3 stops in the forenoon. One at a place where the horses could be watered, the second at a chuck wagon belonging to cowboys who were riding after stock, and the third at a small cluster of adobe stone houses constituting a hamlet the driver called Longstreth, was named after the colonel. From that point on to Fairdale, there was only a few ranches, each one controlling great acreage. Early in the afternoon, from a ridge top, Duane sighted Fairdale, a green patch in the mass of gray. For the barrens of Texas it was indeed a fair sight, but he was more concerned with its remoteness from civilization than its beauty. At that time, in the early 70s, when the vast western third of Texas was a wilderness, the pioneer had done wonders to settle there and establish places like Fairdale. It indeed needed only a glance for Duane to pick out Colonel Longstreth's ranch. The house was situated on the only elevation ground in Fairdale, not very high, nor more than a few minutes' walk from the edge of town. It was a low, flat-roof structure made of red adobe bricks and covered what appeared to be a full acre of ground. All was green about it except where the fence corrals and numerous barns or sheds showed gray and red. Duane soon reached the shady outskirts of Fairdale and entered the town with mingled feelings of curiosity and eagerness and expectation. The street he rode down was the main one, and on both sides of the street was a solid row of saloons, resorts, and hotels. Saddled horses stood hitched all along the sidewalk in 2 long lines, with a buckboard and a team here and there breaking up the continuity. This block was busy and noisy. From all outside appearances, Fairdale was no different from any other frontier towns, and Duane's expectations were scarcely realized. As the afternoon was waning and he halted at a little inn, Boy took charge of his horse, and Duane questioned the lad about Fairdale and gradually drew to the subject most in his mind. "Colonel Longstreth has a big outfit, huh?" "Reckon he has," replied the lad. "Don't know how many cowboys are always coming and going. I ain't acquainted with half of 'em." "Much movement of stock these days?" "Stock's always moving," he replied with a weird look. "Rustlers?" But he did not follow up that look with the affirmative Duane expected. "Lively place, I hear Fairdale is." "Ain't so lively as Sanderson's, but it's bigger." "Yeah, I heard it was. Fellow down there was talking about 2 cowboys who were arrested." "Sure, I heard all about that. Joe Bean and Brick Higgins. They belong, but they ain't here much. Longstreth's boys." Duane did not want to appear over-inquisitive, so he turned to talk to the other channels. After getting supper, Duane strolled up and down the main street. When darkness set in, he went into the hotel, bought cigars, sat around, and watched. Then he passed out and went into the next place. This was a rough, crude exterior, but the inside was comparatively pretentious and ablaze with lights. It was full of men coming and going, a dusty-booted crowd that smelled of horses and smoke. Dwayne sat down for a while with wide eyes and opened ears. Then he hunted up to the bar where most of the guests had been or were going. He found a great square room lighted by 6 huge lamps, a bar at one side, and all the floor space taken up by tables and chairs. This was the only gambling place of any size in southern Texas, in which he had noted the absence of Mexicans. There was some card playing going on at this moment. Dwayne stayed in there for a while and knew that strangers were too common in Fairdale to be conspicuous. Then he returned to the inn where he had engaged a room. Dwayne sat down on the steps of the dingy little restaurant, and 2 men were conversing inside, and they had not noticed Dwayne. "Laramie, what's the stranger's name?" asked one. "He didn't say," replied the other. "Sure was a strapping big man. Struck me a little odd, he did." "No cattleman, him. How'd you size him?" "Well, like one of them cool, easy, quiet Texan who's been looking for a man for years to kill him when he found him." "Right you are, Laramie, and between you and me, I hope he's looking for long—" "Shh," interrupted Laramie. "He must be half drunk to go talking that way." Thereafter they conversed in too low a tone for Dwayne to hear, and presently Laramie's visitor left. Dwayne went outside, making himself agreeable, began to ask casual questions about Fairdale. Laramie was not communicative. Dwayne went to his room in thoughtful frame of mind. Had Laramie's visitor meant he hoped someone had come here to kill Longstreth? Dwayne inferred just that from the interrupted remark. There was something wrong about the mayor of Fairdale. Dwayne felt it, and he felt also if there was a crooked and dangerous man, it was Floyd Lawson, the innkeeper. Laramie would be worth cultivating. And last in Dwayne's thought that night was Miss Longstreth. He could not keep thinking of her, how strangely the meeting with her had affected him. Made him remember the long past time when girls had been part of his life. What a sad and dark, endless void lay between the past and the present. He had no right to even dream of a beautiful woman like Ray Longstreth. That conviction, however, did not dispel her. Indeed, it seemed perversely to make her grow more fascinating. Dwayne grew conscious of a strange, unaccountable hunger, and something like that was a pang in his breast. Next day he lounged about the inn. He did not make any overtures to the Tectrum, the proprietor. Dwayne had no need to hurry now. He contented himself with watching and listening, and the close of the day he decided Fairdale was what McNelly had claimed it to be, and that he was on track of an unusual adventure. The following day he spent in much the same way, though on one occasion he told Laramie he was looking for a man. The innkeeper grew a little bit less furtive and reticent after that. He would answer casual queries, and it did not take Dwayne long to learn that Laramie had seen better days, that he's now broken, bitter, and hard. Someone had wronged him. Several days passed. Dwayne did not succeed in getting any closer to Laramie, but he found the idlers on the corners and in front of the stores unsuspicious and willing to talk. It did not take long to find out Fairdale stood parallel with Huntsville for gambling, drinking, and fighting. The street was always lined with dusty saddle horses, the town full of strangers. Money appeared more abundant than in any place Dwayne had ever visited, and it was spent with abandon that spoke forcibly of easy and crooked acquirement. Dwayne decided that Sanderson, Bradford, and Ord were but notorious outposts for this Fairdale, which was a secret center of rustlers and outlaws. And what struck Dwayne strangest of all was the fact that Longstreth was mayor here and held court daily. Dwayne knew intuitively, before a chance remark gave him proof, that this court was a sham, a farce, and he wondered if it were not blind. This wonder of his equivalent to suspicion of Colonel Longstreth, and Dwayne reproached himself. Then he realized the reproach was because of the daughter. Inquiry had brought him the fact that Ray Longstreth had come to live with her father. Longstreth had originally been a planter in Louisiana, where his family had remained after his advent in the West. He was a rich rancher. He owned half of Fairdale. He was a cattle buyer on a large scale. Floyd Lawson was his lieutenant and associate in deals. On the afternoon of the 5th day of Duane's stay in Fairdale, he returned to the inn from his usual stroll, and upon entering was amazed to have a rough-looking young fellow rush by him out of the door. Inside, Laramie was lying on the floor with a bloody bruise on his face, and he did not appear to be dangerously hurt. "Bo Snicker. He hit me and went off after the cash drawer," said Laramie, laboring to his feet. "Are you hurt much?" queried Duane. "I guess not, but Bo needn't have socked me. I've been robbed before without that." "Well, take a look after Bo," replied Duane. He went out and glanced down the street toward the center of town. He did not see anyone he could take for the innkeeper's assailant. Then he looked up the street and saw the young fellow about a block away, hurrying along and gazing back. Duane yelled for him to stop and started to go after him. Snicker broke into a run, then Duane set out to overhaul him. There were two motives in Duane's action, one of anger and the other desire to make a friend of this Laramie, whom Duane believed he could tell him a lot. Duane was light on his feet and had a giant stride. He gained rapidly upon Snicker, who, turning this way and that, could not get out of sight. Then he took to open country and ran straight for the green hill where Longstreth's house stood. Duane had almost caught Snicker when he reached the shrubbery and trees, and there eluded him. But Duane kept him in sight, in the shade on the paths and up the road into the courtyard, and he saw Snicker go straight for Longstreth's house. Duane was not to be turned back by that, singular as it was. He did not stop to consider. He seemed enough to know that fate had directed him to the path of this rancher Longstreth. Duane entered the first open door on the side of the court. It opened into a corridor which led into the plaza. It had a wide, smooth stone porches and flowers and shrubbery in the center. Duane hurried through to burst into the presence of Miss Longstreth and a number of young people. Evidently, she was giving a little party. Lawson stood leaning against one of the pillars that supported the porch roof. At the sight of Duane, his face changed remarkably, expressing amazement, consternation, and then fear. In the quick ensuing silence, Miss Longstreth rose, white as her dress. The young women present stared in astonishment, if they're not equally perturbed. There were cowboys present who suddenly grew intent and still. By these things, Duane gathered that his appearance must be disconcerting. He was panting. He wore no coat or hat. His big gun sheath showed plainly on his hip. Sight of Miss Longstreth had uncountable effect upon Duane. He was plunged into confusion. For the moment, he saw no one but her. "Miss Longstreth, I came to search your house," panted Duane. He hardly knew what he was saying, yet the instant he spoke, he realized that he should have been the last thing for him to say. He blundered, but he was not used to women, and this dark-eyed girl made him thrill, and his heart beat thickly, and his wits go scattering. "Search my house!" exclaimed Miss Longstreth, and red succeeded the white in her cheeks. She appeared astonished and angry. "What for? Why, how dare you? This is unwarrantable." "A man, Bo Snicker, assaulted and robbed Jim Laramie," replied Duane hurriedly. "I chased him here. I saw him run into the house." "Here? Oh, sir, you must be mistaken. We've seen no one in the absence of my father and my mistress here. I will not permit you to search." Lawson appeared to come out of his astonishment. He stepped forward. "Ray, don't be bothered now," he said to his cousin. "This fellow's making a bluff. I'll settle him. See here, mister, you clear out." "I want Snicker. He's here, and I'm going to get him," replied Duane quietly. "It's all a bluff," sneered Lawson. "I'm on to your game. You just wanted an excuse to break in here to see my cousin again. When you saw the company, you invented that excuse. Now be off, or it'll be worse for you." Duane felt his face burn with a tide of blood. Almost he felt he was guilty of such motive. He had not been able to put this Ray Longstreth out of his mind. There seemed to be scorn in her eyes, and somehow that checked his embarrassment. "Miss Longstreth, will you let me search the house?" he asked. "No. Then I regret to say I do so without your permission." "You'll not dare," she flashed. She stood erect, her bosom swelling. "Pardon me, yes, I will." "Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm a Texas Ranger," replied Duane. "Texas Ranger?" she echoed. Floyd Lawson's dark face turned pale. "Miss Longstreth, I don't need warrants to search your house," said Duane. "I'm sorry to annoy you. I'd prefer to have your permission. A ruffian has taken refuge here in your father's house. He's hidden somewhere. May I look for him?" "If you are indeed a ranger." Duane produced his papers. Miss Longstreth haughtily refused to look at them. "Miss Longstreth, I've come to make Fairdale safer, cleaner, better place for women and children. I don't wonder at your resentment, but to doubt me, insult me, someday you may be sorry." Floyd Lawson made a violent motion with his hands. "Oh, stuff, cousin. Go on with your party. I'll take a couple of cowboys and go with this ranger." "Thanks," said Duane coolly. He eyed Lawson. "Perhaps you'll be able to find Snecker quicker than I could." "What do you mean?" demanded Lawson. Now he grew livid. Evidently he was a man of fierce, quick passions. "Don't quarrel," said Miss Longstreth. "Floyd, you go with him. Please hurry. I'll be nervous till the man's found or you're sure he's not there." They started with several cowboys to search the house and went through the rooms, searching, calling out, peering in dark places. It struck Duane more than forcibly that Lawson did all the calling. He was hurried, tried to keep in the lead. Duane wondered if he knew his voice and be recognized by the hiding man. Be that as it might, it was Duane who peered into the dark corner and then, with a gun leveled, said, "Come out." He came forth into the flare, a tall, slim, dark-faced youth wearing a sombrero, blouse, and trousers. Duane collared him before any of the others could move and held the gun close enough to make him shrink. But he did not impress Duane as being frightened just then. Nevertheless, he had a clammy face and a proud look of a man who had just gotten over a shock. He peered into Duane's face and then into that of the cowboy next to him, then into Lawson's, and if ever Duane's life he beheld relief, it was then. That was all Duane needed to know, but it meant to find out more if he could. "Who are you?" asked Duane quietly. "Bo Snecker," he said. "What'd you hide here for?" He appeared to grow sullen. "Reckon I'd be safe in Longstreth as anywheres." "Ranger, what do you do with him?" Lawson queried, as if uncertain. Now the capture was made. "I'll see to that," replied Duane. He pushed Snecker in front of him out into the court. Duane had suddenly conceived the idea of taking Snecker before Mayor Longstreth in the court. When Duane arrived at the hall where the court was held, there were other men there, a dozen or more, and all seemed excited. Evidently news of Duane had preceded him. Longstreth sat at a table up on a platform. Near him sat a thick-set, grizzled man with deep eyes, and this was Hanford Owens, county judge. To the right stood a tall, angular, yellow-faced fellow with droopy, sandy mustache. Conspicuous on his vest was a huge silver shield. This was Gorshess, one of Longstreth's sheriffs. There were 4 other men whom Duane knew by sight. Several of those faces were familiar, and half a dozen strangers, all dusty horsemen. Longstreth pounded hard on the table to be heard. Mayor or not, he was unable to quell the excitement. Gradually, however, it subsided, and from the last few utterances before the quiet was restored, Duane gathered that he had intruded upon some kind of meeting in the hall. "What do you break in here for?" demanded Longstreth. "Isn't this court?" "Aren't you the mayor of Fairdale?" interrogated Duane. His voice was clear and loud, almost piercing. "Yes," replied Longstreth. Like flint he seemed, yet Duane felt his intense interest. "I've arrested a criminal," said Duane. "Arrested a criminal?" said Longstreth. "You? Who are you?" "I'm a ranger," replied Duane. A significant silence ensued. "I charge Snecker with assault on Laramie and attempted robbery, if not murder. He's had a shady past here, as this court will know if it keeps a record." "What's this here about you, Bo?" Get up and speak for yourself, said Longstreth gruffly. Snecker got up, not without a furtive glance at Duane, and he had shuffled forward a few steps toward the mare. He had an evil front, but not the boldness of a rustler. It ain't so, Longstreth, he began loudly. I went to Laramie's place for grub. Some feller I never seen before come in the hall and hit Laramie and wrestled him to the floor. I went out. Then this big ranger chased me and fetched me here. I didn't do nothing. This ranger's hankering to arrest somebody. That's not my hutch, Longstreth. Longstreth said something undertoned to Judge Owens that was worthy, nodded his great bushy head. Bo, you're discharged, said Longstreth bluntly. Now the rest of you clear out of here. He absolutely ignored the ranger. That was his rebuff to Duane, his slap in the face to an interfering ranger service. If Longstreth was crooked, he certainly had magnificent nerve. Duane almost decided he was above suspicion, but his nonchalance, his air of finality, his authoritative assurance, these to Duane's keen and practiced eyes were in significant contrast to certain tenseness of the line about his mouth and the slow paling of his olive skin. In that momentary lull, Duane's scrutiny of Longstreth gathered an impression of the man's intense curiosity. Then the prisoner, Snecker, with a cough that broke the spell of silence, shuffled a couple of steps toward the door. Hold on, called Duane. The call halted Snecker as if it had been a bullet. Longstreth, I saw Snecker attack Laramie, said Duane, his voice still ringing. What was the court say to that? The court has this to say. West of the Pecos will not aid any ranger service. We don't want you out here. Fairdale doesn't need you. That's a lie, Longstreth, retorted Duane. I have letters from Fairdale citizens all begging for ranger service. Longstreth turned white. The veins corded his temples. He appeared about to burst into rage. He was at a loss for a quick reply. Floyd Lawson rushed in and up to the table. The blood showed black and thick in his face. His utterance was incoherent. His uncontrollable outbreak of temper seemed out of all proportion to any cause he should reasonably have for anger. Longstreth shoved him back with a curse and a warning glare. Where's your warrant to arrest Snecker? Shouted Longstreth. I don't need warrants to make arrests, Longstreth. You're ignorant of the power of Texas Rangers. You'll come none of your damned ranger stunts out here. I'll block you. That passionate reply of Longstreth's was a signal Duane had been waiting for. He had hoped on this crisis. He wanted to force Longstreth's hand and show the town his stand. Duane backed clear of everybody. Men, I call on you, cried Duane personally. I call on you to witness the arrest of a criminal prevented by Longstreth, mayor of Fairdale. It will be recorded in the report to the adjutant general at Austin. Longstreth, you'll never prevent another arrest. Longstreth sat white with working jaw. Longstreth, you've shown your hand, said Duane in a voice that carried far and held those who heard. Any honest citizen of Fairdale can now see what's plain. Yours is a damn poor hand. You're going to hear me call a spade a spade. In the 2 years you've been mayor, you've never arrested one rustler. Strange, when Fairdale's a nest of rustlers. You never sent a prisoner to Del Rio, let alone to Austin. You have no jail. There have been 9 murders during your office, innumerable street fights and hold-ups. Not one arrest, but you have ordered arrests for trivial offenses and have punished these out of proportion. There have been lawsuits in your courts over water rights, cattle deals, property lines. Strange in how these lawsuits, you or Lawson or other men close to you are always involved. Strange how it seems the law was stretched to favor your interest. Duane paused in his cold, ringing speech. In the silence, both outside and inside the hall, could be heard the deep breathing of agitated men. Longstreth was indeed a study, yet did he betray anything but rage at this interloper? Longstreth, here's plain talk for you, Fairdale, went on Duane. I don't accuse you in your court of dishonesty. I say strange. Law here has been a farce. The motive behind all this laxity isn't plain to me yet, but I will call your hand.